Welcome everyone to Humanism, Chaplaincy, and Non-Religious Spiritual Care, led by Sarah Harbaugh. This program is hosted by the Blum Resource Center. Over at the Blum, we are grateful to the Center for Spiritual Care for this continued partnership. The recording of this session will be posted on our Blum YouTube playlist and our Blum Digital Resource Center. For those of you watching live, if you have any questions related to today's program, please feel free to utilize the chat feature throughout the session. At the end of the session, your questions in the chat will be used to moderate a Q&A. If you have any other questions or would like more information about resources and programs offered through the Blum, please visit our website at www.dana-farber.org/resource center or email us at blum_center@dfci.harvard.edu. Thank you all for joining us. I will now pass the workshop over to DFCI Multi-Faith Chaplain, Sarah.
Thank you, Sierra. So good morning, everybody. My name is Sarah Harbaugh, and I'm excited to join you today and talk more about demystifying spiritual care in today's presentation on chaplaincy, humanism, and non-religious spiritual care. I'd like to start just first by introducing myself. Again, my name's Sarah, and I'm a staff chaplain here at Dana-Farber. My chaplaincy work is multi-faith, which means it's oriented towards people of any faith tradition or background. But it is informed by my personal spiritual faith and my identity as a spiritual and non-religious humanist. My experience in chaplaincy includes senior care in a skilled nursing facility, level 1 trauma care, and intensive care at a general hospital, and of course, outpatient ambulatory care with cancer patients here at Dana-Farber. I'm very excited to be joining you all today and the opportunity to present, and a big thank you to Sierra and the Blum Center for inviting me to talk about spiritual care today. It's great to be here. I wish I could see you all, but I appreciate your presence, even if I can't see you. So let's jump in with a question. What do you think of when you hear the word chaplain or chaplaincy? I invite you to add your response in the chat if a word or a sentence comes to mind. But I also have some common responses I've heard from patients before to share, just for us to explore and talk about. What do you think of when you hear the word chaplain or chaplaincy? So one of the most common things people think is that chaplaincy is about religion. And I know this because often when I introduce myself and my work, folks will say, "Oh, no need, I'm not religious." So for some people, chaplaincy may be associated with Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, or other major world religions. I also hear folks say that a chaplain comes to pray or maybe to perform a sacrament like communion. And I've heard some people say that a chaplain comes when you're going to get bad news. Like if the chaplain is called by another care team member, a patient might wonder, "Oh, what happened? What is the chaplain going to tell me? You know, what kind of news is coming?" Yeah, it could be bad news. And some people haven't heard of a chaplain or aren't sure what chaplaincy is about. Some people worry that a chaplain could be coming to preach or evangelize, that they might impose a religious perspective on their experience. And for that reason, some folks don't want to meet with a chaplain, especially if this person is non-religious themselves. But these are all pretty common ideas, expectations, even worries about chaplaincy. And it makes sense. The term chaplain comes from a historical Christian context, and modern chaplaincy has roots in Christian seminary curriculum. It's true that the population of chaplains is more diverse now than ever before, but a chaplain is still more likely to be white, male, and Christian. So there's a smaller population of diverse chaplains from different identities and religious backgrounds. But this chaplain of this image of who a chaplain is, at least in our United States context, has been popularized in media by characters like Father Mulcahy from MASH, and just this image of the white male Christian chaplain. And so our responses, or these common responses from the previous slide, are correct. And it does point to what chaplaincy looks like in some spaces. Religious, Christian, related to prayer, sacrament. But today, I'd love for us to explore what else chaplaincy can look like, especially for the growing non-religious population of today's world. So in fact, Pew Research has been tracking the population of religious nuns, or folks who are religiously unaffiliated in America over the past 15 years or more. In 2014, a study conducted in major cities across the United States gathered data on this population, and in just the Boston area, the study revealed 1/3 of adults identify as non-religious. The data from the graph on the left tracks growth of population of those who identify as religiously unaffiliated in national surveys across all 50 states from 2007 to 2021. And at the time it was published in 2022, the ratio of Christians to non-religious persons was 2 to 1, 2 Christians for every non-religious person. And a ratio, that same ratio had been 5 to 1 in just 2007. So a big change over less than 10 years, or a little more than 10 years. And this January of 2024, an update to the Pew Center's research revealed that the population of people who are non-religious currently outnumber the populations of religiously affiliated people, each according to their tradition. The graph on the right breaks down who makes up the population of religious nuns. And you can see there's a similar amount of people who identify specifically as atheist or agnostic, but there's a much larger percentage of people who describe themselves as identifying with nothing in particular. So non-religious, maybe spiritual, maybe nothing. But a question that comes to mind for me is, if a large population of people in Boston and patients or families here at Dana-Farber are non-religious, what can chaplaincy offer to them? So today, I'd like to address the gap between chaplaincy's historic origins of being a religious office born out of a Christian context and the non-religious population of today's world. And I'll be exploring this question throughout the presentation by redefining spirituality and identifying how chaplaincy can be a resource for non-religious patients. So, what is spirituality? Or how can we define spirituality? And this is actually a complicated question to approach, because spirituality or the human spirit, it's something we can't see or touch or quantify really specifically, but we know it when we feel it. We know when we feel spiritual or feel a different kind of sensation from that. Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines spiritual as something being of, relating to, consisting of, or affecting the spirit, which is a pretty vague definition, right? Not only is spirituality hard to describe or define due to its intangible nature, spirituality is also a really subjective experience, different from one individual to another and unique to every person. So it makes sense that the dictionary definition is broad and leaves space for the multitudes of what spirituality could look like. It would be difficult, I imagine, to include in the dictionary how some folks might feel the most spiritual out in nature, looking at the sunrise, while other people could feel the most spiritual when they're cooking foods and preparing a meal for loved ones. While others could feel their most spiritual when practicing their religion. And something worth noting is that religion can be categorized apart from spirituality. While the two share many qualities, they are not exclusively related to each other. And some of those distinctions are listed here. But to sum it all up, one source describes religion as a collective practice of spirituality that is characterized by shared texts, practices, beliefs, or symbols. Religion can be spiritual, and someone's spirituality could revolve around their religion. But again, these are not exclusively connected. One can be spiritual and non-religious. But let's look more closely at spirituality and what it means, how a non-religious person could describe spirituality. Like we said, it's difficult to give one singular definition, but there are many different definitions of spirituality in the world, authored by spiritual leaders, philosophers, even doctors and researchers. And what is common among these definitions is the description of spirituality as being about connection, harmony, and meaning. Connection speaks to experiences when we feel the most connected to ourselves, others, and more. Getting in touch with who we truly are, feeling proud of ourselves or loving ourselves, fosters this sense of inner connection. And connection is also brought about by having a sense of relationship with our loved ones, like friends and family, through spending time together and sharing key experiences. Connection also relates to feeling that you belong in a larger society. Maybe that's your workplace, your neighborhood, or your hometown community. Spirituality also includes fostering connection to something bigger than oneself, like the natural world around us, or our environment, the universe. And spirituality incorporates or can incorporate a belief or a connection to what's beyond the tangible world. This could be connection to the spirit of past loved ones, to God or a higher power, or to what you personally define as the ultimate. Those connections shape us, they can define us, and they bring a powerful sense of belonging to our lives. Harmony builds off our sense of connection to ourselves and to others. Think of a time maybe if you feel you have to perform or act a certain way around others that isn't truly who you are. That might be a moment when you lose a sense of harmony in life as identity becomes unbalanced. So exploring one's values, one's integrity, and what matters most to you as part of defining yourself and your identity is a spiritual journey. And when you identify these parts of who you are, integrating them into your daily life establishes a sense of harmony. It makes you feel real, authentic, and brings about personal fulfillment from this spiritual work of exploring and finding harmony within yourself and the way that you engage with others around you. And finally, spirituality is about meaning. What is your life narrative? And how do you tell your story? What are the personal truths or beliefs that give meaning and purpose to your life? Searching for meaning is very personal and involves finding answers that bring one peace. Our search for meaning is also related to how we make sense of unexpected struggles in life. Having a sense of meaning helps us be resilient when we are faced with a sudden change, or it can bring clarity and understanding to find meaning as we go through struggle. And this aspect of spirituality, meaning, is particularly relevant to the folks who come to Dana-Farber, to patients with cancer. Having a way to make meaning of how cancer has changed your life, how it has changed the way you live and the way you see yourself, can be part of transforming suffering into healing. I wanted to start by defining spirituality in this presentation to expand the idea of who benefits from spiritual care. As we mentioned before, there's a certain association or assumption of chaplaincy with religion, and I think spirituality can get tangled up in those associations as well. But by deconstructing and examining what spirituality is, what aspects of life it affects, and how it relates to people who are non-religious, we clarify who spirituality is relevant to. Because if everyone has spiritual dimensions to their lives, which we all do, everyone deserves to receive spiritual support when they need it. So I'll invite you to reflect further on what spirituality means to you and what your own definition of spirituality is at the end of the presentation. But for now, we can say our working definition of spirituality is an ongoing subjective journey where one seeks a harmonious existence through feeling connection with oneself, others, nature, and the larger world and beyond, to experience, to find the meaning and purpose of one's life. Spirituality is in our everyday. Sometimes it is the simple moment that we might not even notice, like feeling joy on a sunny day, connecting with a loved one, or having that moment of authenticity or harmony. But there are other times when the spirituality in our everyday is when we are lost, when we are hurt, and when we are left searching for meaning. And in those days, we will need to look deeper, to reflect on our thoughts and feelings, and even our sense of self, to find a new way of feeling peace. We call those grievous moments spiritual pain or spiritual distress. And those times in our lives can be immensely heavy on our hearts and our spirits. I believe it's quite important to talk about this and its particular relevance to cancer patients, to acknowledge spiritual and emotional parts of ourselves that need care, especially for non-religious patients. Spiritual pain is described as a pain deep in your being that is not physical. One of the most obvious examples of spiritual pain is grief, as one copes with the pain that comes from losing a loved one and how that loss can change your whole life. But spiritual pain is studied and researched in medicine as it relates to sudden and advanced illness like cancer or end-of-life circumstances. Spiritual pain in this context could be caused by the loss of one's identity, loss of one's purpose, or loss of one's beliefs and sense of meaning as the circumstances of their illness impact and intensely change their life. Dame Cicely Saunders, who was a founder of modern hospice, she coined the term total pain to describe the depth of pain or suffering a patient might experience. Total pain acknowledges the combination of physical, psychological, social, and spiritual components as part of one's overall well-being, and how each component affects others when pain is present. And you can see that interplay in the diagram here. Researchers Anita Mehta and Lisa S. Chan say this about total pain in cancer patients. Cancer pain is distinguished from other types of pain that result from other illnesses because of its unpredictable course, which can vary dramatically in severity and duration, depending on the type of treatment and disease progression. The significant life changes and unpredictability caused by cancer disturb a patient's sense of harmony in life. It can strain connections to self and to others, and can rattle the meaning and purpose of living, causing spiritual pain. This kind of pain is sometimes verbalized by cancer patients through questions like, who am I without my job? I can't go back to work now. Why did this happen to me? Or why did God do this to me? Or even, what will happen to my loved ones when I die? Those are common statements and questions that come up when a patient is feeling spiritual pain. And spiritual pain can also include experiences of grief, guilt, hopelessness, fear, and serious doubts. And I just want to normalize that it is totally fair to have these feelings, to have these experiences of loss and pain and hardship, because being diagnosed with cancer, living through the illness itself and the treatment is an incredibly difficult journey. And so it seems, natural or normal for these questions and this kind of pain to arise. But it also needs to be attended to and provided care for. And that's what I want to keep talking about. Studies show unaddressed spiritual pain can contribute to a patient's total pain and further agitate physical, social, and psychological pain. You can see here experiences of spiritual pain linked to symptoms such as denial, loneliness, and increased anxiety. One study on spirituality in advanced cancer patients found spiritual pain was common among patients who were experiencing worse symptoms of depression, anorexia, drowsiness, anxiety, and more. And this graph shows levels of symptom intensity in patients without spiritual pain in blue, and then symptom intensity of patients with spiritual pain in yellow. So you can see the distinction of the increased intensity. And when patients were asked in this study if spiritual pain made their physical and emotional symptoms worse, those who reported spiritual pain were significantly more likely to agree. And also in the context of this study, spiritual pain was significantly associated with patients who described themselves as less religious. Other studies have explored how often spiritual care needs are not identified, are not self-reported, or not addressed in the course of a patient's care. At one cancer clinic, studies of a patient intake survey revealed that 0.2% of patients identified spirituality as a concern for them. But further in the survey that explored their symptoms and their experiences, it was revealed more than 38% of patients were experiencing symptoms associated with spiritual pain. So less than 1% of patients had spirituality or spiritual symptoms on their mind, and almost 40% of them were experiencing that pain and that need for care. These findings raise a question for me of how or if spiritual care is introduced to patients, and what kind of general awareness of spiritual pain and spiritual needs is available to patients as something that can be addressed and incorporated in their healing process. And I believe this education and awareness is particularly important for non-religious patients and their families. These studies and more reveal that there is a significant need for spiritual support in cancer care to address a patient's total pain or total experience of cancer and their specific spiritual needs. So now that we have a basic understanding of spirituality and spiritual pain, let's talk about how chaplaincy addresses spiritual needs. As I mentioned earlier, the term chaplaincy and its field of work comes from the Christian tradition, and in that historic context, beginning as far back as around 800 CE, a chaplain was a clergy person who worked outside the church to provide spiritual guidance, facilitate religious rituals, and to be a compassionate presence to everyday people in need. And that is effectively how chaplaincy functioned for hundreds of years. Catholic or Christian clergymen were providing spiritual care in secular spaces like the military, hospitals, universities, and in government. But chaplaincy developed significantly in the 20th century as the field established a standard curriculum of education, and the field began expanding to include ministers and leaders from spiritual traditions and religions other than Christianity. Today, you might hear chaplaincy called spiritual care or pastoral care, but all of these terms point to the same field of specialized spiritual caregivers. Here are some of the skills chaplains develop over years of studying and training. I'll pause just to look over those, take them in. And for those who haven't had a chaplain visit, these skills are used primarily in conversation. Often a chaplain visit begins by asking how a patient is doing today or in the course of their treatment. And using the skill of attentive listening and presence, a chaplain will meet a patient where they're at, will stay to listen and hear how the patient is doing on their own terms. And as the conversation continues, a chaplain may invite more storytelling from the patient or ask open-ended questions to make space for reflection and acknowledgement of the spiritual pain or spiritual needs that are present. Over time, either in the course of one visit or over the course of several visits, a patient may find that a chaplain visit is space for them to express their feelings, to sit with their grief, explore what is sacred and meaningful to them, or simply to name their hopes and fears all in relationship to their experience of going through cancer and their illness journey. A chaplain doesn't come to a visit ready with answers or a prescription for faith for a spiritually pained person. Instead, we come with ears to listen and a compassionate presence to attend to the reality of a patient's spiritual needs. A skilled chaplain knows how to make space for a patient to find their own inner wisdom and to begin healing from within. To put it simply, chaplaincy is about being with another person in their time of need. Our role is to hear you where you are, and if or when the moment calls for it, to invite you to explore what the moment means to you and how you'll get through it. For non-religious persons, for those diagnosed with cancer, for caregivers, and for staff, spiritual care is an important part of whole person care. And regardless of their faith background, all chaplains are equipped with the same skills and sensitivities learned through years of standardized training. At this point in the presentation, you may be thinking, oh, it makes sense that I am focusing on non-religious patients since I myself am non-religious. But what about religious chaplains, right? Can a Jewish or Buddhist chaplain provide spiritual care to a non-religious person? And the answer is yes. Chaplaincy is focused on providing care to care-seeking persons in a way that honors and incorporates their beliefs. A chaplain's personal, spiritual, or religious beliefs should never be imposed in conversation. And chaplains at Dana-Farber respect and provide care to people of all spiritual, religious, and non-religious backgrounds. So for example, my personal spiritual background is based in the philosophy of humanism. And for those who aren't familiar with humanism, it's a philosophy that has evolved over hundreds of years from ancient Chinese or Greek philosophers to Enlightenment era thinkers to 20th century social justice leaders and to today. Like spirituality, there is no one definition of humanism. I've included here the kind of description of humanism from the American Humanist Association. But humanism itself is a philosophy that's oriented around the human responsibility of contributing to the greater good of society according to the world's needs in one's lifetime. My work as a chaplain is informed by humanist values that affirm the preciousness of all life, the common humanity of people across their differences, and a respect towards other philosophies, spiritualities, religions, and the people who practice them. My humanist philosophy is present in everything I do because it informs my reason to be a chaplain. And it challenges me to be a better person in the world and a better chaplain to every patient or every family member or every staff person that I encounter. But that being said, when I am with a patient of any faith or any background, I am not hearing their story through the lens of humanism or waiting to offer advice from my philosophical perspective. Neither am I dismissive of patients who do practice a religion or believe in a specific way of seeing God or following certain doctrine that I do not personally subscribe to. When I am with a patient, I am listening to hear their story in their words, to attend to their spiritual needs or their spiritual pain as they describe it, and inviting them to explore what will help them find healing and a greater sense of peace on their terms. And it is this philosophy or mission of chaplaincy itself to reflect and acknowledge a patient's spiritual experience without imposing one's own that orients chaplains in providing skillful care to patients of any and all spiritual backgrounds. So one case study that I love to share is the example of non-religious spiritual care that was made popular by Fred Rogers, the creator of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And to be frank, he was not trained traditionally in the field of chaplaincy, but Mr. Rogers did study Christian ministry, child development, and education, and he also went on to become ordained by the Presbyterian Church to work in children's ministry. His show grew to national popularity as a children's television program that focused on curiosity, imagination, emotional needs, self-awareness, and connection with others. His work touched the hearts and minds of children and families across the nation, creating a televised presence of care and affirmation for generations. So I'll read this quote from Mr. Rogers. "You make each day a special day. You know how? By just your being you. There's only one person in this whole world like you, and people can like you exactly as you are." In this quote, Mr. Rogers affirms his listener just as they are, providing a compassionate, non-judgmental presence to them simply being themselves. And throughout his show, he made space for his listeners to be themselves and to find themselves with gentle reflections and compassionate presence. Rogers was certainly motivated and informed by his personal religious background, having studied Presbyterian ministry and Christian scripture for years. But in his care for children and families, his faith was never imposed or even referenced in the show. So for the non-religious, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood gives a window into the ways that spiritual care is available and how a chaplain is present to reflect and affirm the care seeker in where they find meaning. Now, I know the format of spiritual care in a children's television show is quite different from the format you might find here in adult cancer care. But the skills and the orientation towards whole person care in both Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and healthcare chaplaincy are so similar. I wonder if anyone here remembers watching Mr. Rogers, or if you remember hearing this quote in the show. But for me, anytime I think about the show or the music or the characters, it always just makes me smile. So I was excited to share that with you all today. Back to the research. Earlier, we explored how research shows that spiritual pain can contribute to a patient's total pain and physical symptoms, but the opposite is also true. One study revealed that patients who receive support for spiritual pain or spiritual distress experience improvements in physical symptoms like sleeplessness, anxiety, shortness of breath, and even receiving spiritual care decreased the frequency of their visits to an urgent care clinic or their primary care clinic. Studies on the impact of spiritual care at end-of-life circumstances revealed patients who received support for their spiritual needs were found to have better quality of life and higher levels of satisfaction with their overall care. Spiritual care, working with a chaplain, it provides a space for patients to explore their inner conflicts in their own words and reestablish a sense of connection, harmony, and meaning in their lives through greater self-understanding and inner healing from spiritual pain. Okay, this is where we started with chaplaincy this morning, right? It's an accurate picture, but it's a small picture of what chaplaincy is. So I wonder if I were to ask you now, what does the word chaplaincy make you think of? If it might look more like this. Ta-da! But this just includes more of the vocabulary, skills, and outcomes that we talked about today. Chaplaincy is about making meaning in painful circumstances. It's about identifying what brings you hope, celebrating what is going well. It can be about mourning what has changed in your life or reflecting on the journey to this moment. Chaplaincy is just as much for non-religious persons as it is for those who are religious or spiritual. And if there's a word that comes to mind for you now of what chaplaincy is that you don't see here, I'd love to hear what that word is. So feel free to add that in the chat if there's a word that comes to mind when you think of chaplaincy. So in closing, I wanted to share this quote from Aparna Saja and Christina Pukowski. Sharing suffering through narrative creates meaning. When given this space, patients can recontextualize their life narratives with added purpose to accept and in so transcend suffering. So I am not bold enough to promise that receiving spiritual care or having conversation with a chaplain will immediately help you transcend all suffering. That would be incredible, but I have never seen that happen. What I have seen happen is that when patients have space and the invitation to share their story in a conversation with a chaplain or through receiving spiritual care, that space allows the pain, suffering, and heartache to flow out of a patient through storytelling. And as the research suggests, when we can discharge the spiritual pain through storytelling, through receiving spiritual care, through mourning, acknowledging, accepting, it has the potential to relieve other symptoms of pain. And this is what I believe chaplaincy can offer to non-religious patients and families at Dana-Farber. Care which recognizes and attends to a person's spiritual and holistic needs in the context of their illness journey. So as a final closing question for you to take with you from this presentation, I'll ask, what does spirituality mean to you? Where are you finding connection, harmony, and meaning in your life? I encourage you to explore this on your own terms as a brief spiritual self-care exercise sometime today or this week. What does spirituality mean to you? And I hope however you answer this, whatever answers come to you, that they can be something to ground you as you go through life, whatever's on your plate this week. So here also are references to some of the studies that I included in this presentation and other material. Of course, if you are curious about chaplaincy and want to talk more, or if you are interested in having a chaplain visit at some point in your cancer treatment, you can reach out to me or the spiritual care department here at Dana-Farber. Thank you so much for joining today. I am so glad for the chance to share this presentation with you, and I wish you goodwill and care.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was a great and reflective, very thoughtful presentation. For everyone that's joining us live, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat for Sarah to answer. And as a reminder, the session was recorded and it will be posted on our Blum YouTube playlist and our Blum Digital Resource Center. So I'm just going to see if there was any questions that came in. It doesn't look like we have any questions, but I really want to thank you, Sarah, for taking the time. That was a fabulous presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. It was great to have the chance to talk a little bit more about spiritual care and chaplaincy here at Dana-Farber.